Thank you for joining us today. I hope that you're having a blessed day. We have been looking at the subject now of I will, and I'm trying to encourage you to be intentional in your walk with the Lord. This week we've been looking at John chapter 12, the first 11 verses, and I want to read again verse number 3. Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. And so we are looking at the subject of I will worship. I will worship. We need to be intentional in our worship of the Lord. He is worthy. He is worthy of that. Sometimes we're ill prepared for worship. How often do we think about our acts of worship in our personal life and in our public life? We come to church, and church too often has turned into an entertainment type thing where you have a few people who are leading the worship service, but they too often are seen as those who have responsibility, entertainers, if you will, at times, and then those who sit there and observe. Dear friend, we're not to be observers. We're to be participants in worship. We're to participate in that act of worship that's going on. And so to do that, we have to be intentional in our worship. And so we've been looking at this subject that I will worship. And we see that Mary was intentional in her worship. And we saw yesterday, Mary wasn't focused on her own desires and things. Now we're going to think about this. There's another hindrance to worship, and that is others around us. Oftentimes I've heard people make comments, well, I wanted to do this or I wanted to do that as an act of worship, but I worried about what other people were going to say or what other people were going to do. Mary in this moment wasn't focused really on anyone else. She was focused on Jesus. She had not come to that moment to fellowship with those that were around. She hadn't come to speak to them and to communicate with them. There was a laser focus in her mind that she had come for the purpose to worship God, and she wanted to worship God to the exclusion of everyone and everything else. She didn't care what Judas was gonna say. She didn't care about the opinions of Peter, and she didn't worry about what Martha might think. And you have to believe this, that Martha and Lazarus knew the great expense of this ointment that she was going to use. So she wasn't focused on what everyone else was doing. Her purpose wasn't that to fellowship with them. She wasn't there to give homage or honor to anyone else, dear friend. She didn't come in and recognize anyone. She placed the preeminence of that moment upon Jesus Christ. Now I want to say to you, it's really not going to be a moment of worship unless that's what takes place. We might be worshiping Him for something that He has done, but the preeminence of that moment has to be Jesus. All right, and so she wasn't there for anyone else, and she wasn't going to allow anyone to hinder her from worshiping. She wasn't. She could look around and she could have said certain things. She could have said, "Well, there's people who are more committed to service than I am." I mean, Martha was more committed to serving than Mary was. She could have looked around and she could have said, well, there's others that have had greater spiritual experiences than I've had. I mean, Lazarus is sitting at the table, and he's been raised from the dead. He could share that experience more than Mary could. And, we could go on and on. Mary just wasn't going to allow others in that setting to hinder her from worship. Now, make no mistake about it, there's times it takes effort, does it not, to worship. Now, I've heard people say that have young children and babies that are crying, "Preacher, don't that bother you?" Well, 32 years of preaching, you better get used to some things, dear friend, and know a baby crying don't bother me. I'm going to get focused if I can. I'm not going to be hindered by those things. She wasn't going to be hindered. Her focus was worshiping Jesus. What's the focus of your life today? Is the focus of your life honoring the Lord and praising the Lord? I hope that it is. That was the case for Mary. That ought to be the case for us. Hope you'll think about these things. Till the next time, may God